My name is Loukia. I work with Chris Chambers at Kubrick in Cardiff, and we are currently developing an app for implementing the top guidelines. I'm sure you're all already familiar with the top guidelines as a concept. So top refers to Transparency and Openness Promotion. The guidelines are widely adopted by journals and funders. There are over 5,000 signatories at the moment, which you can find on the Center for Open Science page online. And they have 8 standards, which are modular. So these can be, you can pick and choose which one you would like to implement in your journal policy, and also choose at which level this will be implemented. These standards reflect all aspects of published research, from data transparency to design analysis, pre-registration, and replications. An easy way to remember how the levels vary is to remember these 3 keywords here. So at level 1, you are asked to disclose information. So for example, saying whether you are sharing the data or not. At level 2, this is a requirement. So you have to share the data unless there is a valid reason for not doing so, which also needs to be made explicit. At level 3, a third party verifies that these standards have been met, which means that, for example, a reviewer could be asked to reproduce the results using the data and the code. So this is the gist of the top guidelines. Now, there are a few checklists available on this OSF page here, along with other resources. So what you would do as an author is, depending on the journal where you're submitting the manuscript, is you would answer a few questions about these standards. I'm going to show you an example from Cortex, from a checklist that I don't think is official yet. I don't think it's on a website, but using an example from the data standard, for example, you would have the question, have you archived the study data in a publicly accessible repository? If you answer yes, then all you need to do is specify a URL, which will take you to a trusted repository. Now, if you answer no, things get a bit more complicated. So at level 2, you have to be very specific about why the data are not shared. So if there's a legal or ethical reason for not doing so. And also you have to indicate how the data can be accessed, if they can be accessed at all, if the reader asks for it. So for example, one way to do this would be to request to the ethics committee that you need access to the data, and upon their approval, you could get access. So these are a bit more complicated cases. Yes, so what happens here is this is not as standardized as it could be in terms of answers. So there's a lot of open text responses that the authors need to submit. So it's no one's fault really when there's miscommunications or explanations are not adequate. This happens quite a lot from what we have seen so far. I don't think there's any actual official data on this, but when it happens, the manuscript will get returned, which causes further delays in the review process. So imagine currently there are already delays. If you add that to being having a manuscript returned because you forgot to add a URL or explain why the data are not available, it's a real shame for both the authors and the editors. So Chris Chambers has identified a lot of reasons for non-compliance that come up quite a lot, so they're very frequent. And he has added this in the checklist for Cortex as statements that need to be confirmed. So for example, the author might need to confirm that they understand that the only permissible reasons for not sharing your data or code or materials is a legal or an ethical barrier, while saying that I also understand that it's not an eligible reason for me to say, I intend to publish more papers from the same data, so I will not disclose them just yet. So these are not eligible reasons for level 2 top compliance. At level 1, you don't need to explain anything. Another interesting case is where you talk about data or code, but everything is a little bit more complicated, and some of your materials are publicly available while some are not. This is quite difficult to explain in an open text little box, and this is where people usually contact the editor, and there's a lot of correspondence going back and forth trying to understand what is what. So for this reason and others, we have started developing a standalone Shiny app for the top guidelines. It's quite like a checklist, but a bit more advanced. I am developing this in R, but I'm building it as a standalone desktop app for different platforms. So far, I've gotten the Mac app to work. So the idea is that you click on this and you run everything without having to have R or Shiny or anything like that installed in your computer. So everything is contained within the application. We will release this first at Cortex to pilot everything and get feedback for how it works from both the authors and the top editor. And hopefully we can streamline the development of a larger scale app that can be distributed to other journals. Now, the major goal we have for this is to prevent delays in the review process due to top non-compliance, because a lot of the reasons that the manuscript comes back could really easily have been avoided if there was feedback when you were doing the checklist. So hopefully this will make things easier for both authors and the top editors. So anyone who handles and assesses the checklist responses during the submission process. Now, please be nice. This is alpha of alpha, so I don't like sharing this, but I am. The app is probably going to look like this. So there will be standards that you have to complete. There will be a section on frequently asked questions and tips. So all the information will be contained in the app, some contact information, and then you will have the results on top compliance, which I'll talk about more in a minute. You will also be able to start a session and restore a previous session. So if you want to complete some standards and then get back to it later, you can also do that, because there will be data saved whenever you use the app. The first important component of the app was that it should be interactive. So the authors should only be presented with questions and instructions when these are relevant to their manuscript. What that means, just to give an example. So in standard 2, first we ask you whether the manuscript actually reports any data analysis. If it doesn't, then you don't really need to do anything and you can proceed. If it does, then you get to see more questions. That's quite simple, but still is interactive. So another example where my work gets more complicated is that for standard 5, for design and analysis, there are a lot of things that don't apply to you. In a lot of cases, it's a psychological study, so we have specific questions. In other cases, though, it's a meta-analysis and we don't really need to explain any of this. So depending on the case, the questions differ. Now, without the app, what you would do is you would probably have to skim through 3 or 4 pages of text to figure out what applies to you. Here, if, for example, you have a neuropsychological study in the manuscript and you say yes to this question, then you get a follow-up and we ask you more about it. If you say no, then you see the next question and everything is tailored from here on. It's like a big decision tree. The second important part, which I mentioned already, is that everything is contained in one app. So you don't need to go through the websites and figure out, how everything works. There will also be help buttons. So if you don't want to read through a bunch of text, you don't have to, but if you do need more information, then there are buttons available to help you throughout the app where you can find definitions of what we mean by, for example, a legal barrier, or how to interact with certain components in the app. Now, the most I don't know, it's exciting for me, but the most exciting part of the app is that we catch everything in real time. So there is a real-time feedback for non-compliance. There are warning and error pop-ups and reminders throughout the app completion process. Quite simple examples. So if you missed a URL or if you're missing some responses, you will get an error before proceeding to the next section. If you are tired and you have some inconsistent responses, which has happened to me, then you don't have to worry about anything, because we will tell you before you submit this to the editor. So there will be warnings for every single thing that can go wrong before this goes into submission. Another example is warnings about the types of barriers that are valid for level 2. For example, if you say that the data are not available because I have a technical problem, or because I prefer not to share it, no explanation necessary, then there's going to be a warning that says, unless you have editorial approval, this will probably be returned to you because it's not an eligible reason. Another part of this, which was quite hard to conceptualize, is how to make it standardized, but also quite simple to complete for complicated cases where, like I mentioned before, public availability is not really that simple. So you have, for example, a patient group, and for the raw data, some data are publicly available, but some are not. So this gets a bit more complicated because you have the distinction for raw and processed. You have some data, not all data, and different barriers and conditions for access for each of these. Hopefully, though, the app will help disentangle those. The last part, I don't know if I'm over time, is the top statement that will be produced at the end of the completion. So this will be submitted as a Word document or a PDF, we haven't decided yet, and it can later be included in the manuscript. So this is a work in progress. I don't know what it will look like, but at the end of the paper, like you would have, say, data availability statement, for journals that want to do this, for now this will be at Cortex, it would be a top guideline statement where you have a few summary statements for the standards at their level. So for example, you would have all the data that are publicly available and can be used to produce all analysis, and you would have the repository URL here. Same for code and materials, and then standardized statements for design and analysis and pre-registration. Thank you. If you are an author or a top editor and you have difficulties with using checklists or doing any of this, please reach out. And if you have any feedback or suggestions on features and content that you would like to see, this is also very, very welcome.